Okay, so we're in Parshas Tetzaveh. It's on page 465, and it begins, now you shall command the children of Israel that they shall take for you pure pressed olive oil for illumination, to kindle the lamp continually. In the tent of meeting outside the partition that is near the testimonial tablets, Aaron and his sons shall arrange it from evening until morning before Hashem, an internal decree for their generations from the children of Israel. So this is the beginning. The first topic in the parsha is the bringing the oil for illumination, and there are a few points of this. First of all, the way that it starts is kind of unusual. It starts, "Now you shall command the children of Israel." Usually, when we have a mitzvah in the Torah, usually the mitzvah in the Torah begins, and Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them the following." Whereas here it doesn't. It's just you do this. And in the next paragraph, also in chapter 28, the beginning, it says, "Bring near to yourself Aaron and your brother." If you look in the Hebrew, it says, "And you bring to yourself." It's again, instead of Hashem spoke to Moshe and told him do this, it's "and you do this." And in fact, our sages point out that Tetzaveh is the only parsha from Shemos, from when Moshe was born until the end of the Torah, where Moshe's name is not mentioned once. And that's kind of the point that's making here. It's "and you do this, and you do this," and not Hashem told Moshe to do this, or Hashem spoke to Moshe saying do this, because the whole parsha does not mention the name of Moshe. And our sages say the reason for that is that in Parshas Kisisa, after the Jewish people committed the sin of the golden calf, so Moshe was pleading with Hashem, told Moshe that he's going to destroy the Jewish people. And in Moshe doing his job as the leader of the Jewish people, one aspect of that is to intercede with God for the Jewish people, to pray for them. So Moshe said that if you do that, wipe me out of your book, meaning that he's saying that my name should be wiped out from the Torah if the Jewish people are destroyed and Hashem starts over. And even though Hashem did not do it, but still the words of a tzaddik, the words of a righteous person are always fulfilled. And therefore, whereas Moshe's name is not wiped out of the Torah, it is wiped out of one parsha of the Torah. And that parsha is Parshas Tetzaveh, this week's parsha. And I think it's the Vilna Gaon says, why specifically Tetzaveh out of all the parshas, why is it Tetzaveh that's picked that does not have the name of Moshe? And he answers that Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. And that almost always, the 7th of Adar almost always falls out in the week that we read Tetzaveh. It was actually on Tuesday, was Moshe's Rabbeinu's Yortzeit. And since this is the week that the Parsha that Moshe's Yortzeit almost always falls out, so we don't, so his name's not mentioned in that Parsha. Okay, so now moving on. Oh, and a few other things about the lights. It says that when we take, first of all, it says pure pressed olive oil. What does it mean, pure? Pure means that there's no sediments in the oil. And it says that they're pressed olive for illumination. And the Gemara says, what does that mean? They're pressed olives for illumination. That means that it has to be a press that's specifically for illumination, not for that's not appropriate for, or that's not for drinking, not for eating, not for the other offerings that would use oil. And that is that it has to be the first press specifically. So what they would do is that they would press it the first time and a little bit of oil came out, and that's the finest of the oil. That's used for the light. That's the only oil that could be used for lighting the menorah. And whatever came out after that would be used. It could be used for other things, for the other offerings that the oil is used for, but it can't be used for the menorah. Another thing that they say here is the Ramban points out that it says, or Rashi really points out, it says in verse 20, it says to kindle the lamps continually, which implies that it always has to be lit. And then it says in verse 21, Aaron and his sons shall arrange it from evening until morning before Hashem, which implies that the lights are only lit at night. It's lit from evening until morning, but not continually. So Rashi says that the fact that it's lit every night, even that's called continual, that it's lit every night, even though it's not continuous, meaning that it never goes out. It did go out, but they relit it every night. So it's called continually constant. The Ramban, though, says that these are talking about two different things. The Ramban says that, in fact, all the lights except for one they did allow to go out, and they would light it every night until it would be kept lit from night until morning. But there was one light, that's the Western light. The Western light, that one would be continually lit, and that's the one that was actually the middle light that they were all focused towards. So that light would be constantly lit, and our sages say it was actually miraculous that light never went out, and that's what's referred to when it says a continual light. And the commentaries say that that's why it's specifically Moshe who's told, and you do this, that Moshe has to be the one to, and you command the children of Israel. That is Moshe commanding the children of Israel specifically, because this middle light, this light that's constantly on, we mentioned that the menorah represents we mentioned this last week, that the menorah represents the dissemination of Torah, and it's the light of the Torah shining forth. And the light that's constantly burning in the menorah represents Moshe. The Moshe is our light. He's the one who brought the Torah down to us from heaven and taught us the Torah, and that's all the Torah knowledge that we have comes from Moshe. So that's in the eternal light that we have throughout our generations. And Ramosha Sternbach says also, that's why it says that you shall command the children of Israel in verse 20 that they shall take for you, that they have to take to you this pure pressed olive for illumination. It's not that they take to the temple, but they take it specifically to Moshe. They have to bring the oil to Moshe, and he takes care of it in the temple. Why is it specifically they have to bring it to Moshe? That's because, as we said, that the menorah, the lights of the menorah represent the dissemination of Torah knowledge, and the Torah knowledge has to come through Moshe, meaning that when we study Torah, we might come up with novel ideas, and we might have questions and look for answers, but it all has to be based on tradition, on how we were taught to understand the Torah as a tradition coming as Hashem taught Moshe. As the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, he passed it to Yeshua, his successor as the leader of the Jewish people. Yeshua passed it to the elders to the prophets, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. That the Torah, we have a tradition of how to understand the Torah and how to interpret the Torah, and that's the only way we could really study the Torah. That the Torah is not there as a they call it, the Torah is not hefker, it's not ownerless, and it's not like an unplowed field that anyone could come and understand it however they feel at the moment. That we have traditions, we have a chain all the way going back to Sinai, passed down from generation to generation, how to understand the Torah, how to interpret the Torah, and that's how we have to approach the Torah. So that's why what's representing the light of the Torah has to be passed through Moshe, that they had to bring the oil to Moshe. It wasn't just bring it on your own to the temple. It wasn't just everyone for yourself. Teach the Torah however you feel you should understand it. Okay, so it continues. The next big topic, which takes us almost to the end of the Parsha, is really a double topic. It's about the inauguration of Aaron and his sons as Kohanim, raising them up to be Kohanim. But it begins before that with the making of the special garments for the Kohanim to wear, the garments that they wore, the vestments, they call them, when they did their service. So it begins chapter 28, verse 1 on page 465. Bring near to yourself Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar, the sons of Aaron, to minister to me. And you shall make vestments of sanctity for Aaron, your brother, for glory and splendor. Second. I wrote there. So where am I here? Okay, so moving on in verse 2, or another thing that it says here, that first it says, you shall bring to yourself Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him. And then it says, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar, the sons of Aaron. So it already said you bring Aaron and his sons, and then it enumerates Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar, who those sons were. So why is that? So the commentaries say that, first of all, we've mentioned this over the years many times, but that that whereas now a person is a Kohen because his father was a Kohen. That's the only way someone is a Kohen. It's because his father was a Kohen. There's no, since Pinchas was the only one, there's no promotion that, like, he used to not be a Kohen, you did good service and put the sword on his shoulder. Hereby you are hereby a Kohen. That's not how it works. If someone's father is a Kohen, they're a Kohen, and if not, they never can be. So, but when they were inaugurated, that was not the case. They didn't just inaugurate Aaron, and by virtue of Aaron becoming a Kohen, therefore his sons, being his sons, are automatically Kohanim, because if they, since they were born already, they would not have been born from a Kohen. So they needed a separate inauguration in order to become Kohanim. So he needed to anoint Aaron as a Kohen, but they also had to inaugurate his sons separately as Kohanim. And in fact, there was one descendant of Aaron who was not inaugurated as Kohen, as we mentioned, and that was Pinchas, who was Aaron's grandson, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron's son. And he was not inaugurated as a Kohen because the Torah says specifically just Aaron and his sons. This was a grandson. And because, once again, he was born before his father was made a Kohen, so he was not a son of a Kohen. His father was a Kohen, but he was not born from a Kohen, and therefore he was not made a Kohen. He was made a Kohen later when he acted with the great zealousness for Hashem when he killed Zimri. But this tells us another thing as well, and that is that the sons of Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar, were not just made Kohanim because by virtue of who their father was. That there was something about them themselves that they were appropriate to be made Kohanim because it wasn't an automatic process. It wasn't just your father's a Kohen, so you're a Kohen. They were, each one was specifically, each one of them was specifically inaugurated by virtue of who he was on his own. And that's why the Torah says that the sons of Aaron, first of all, but who is it who is inaugurated? Who are the people who are being inaugurated? It's not just Aaron and therefore his sons. It's Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, and Isamar. All these people are being inaugurated by virtue of themselves, by virtue of who they are, not just by birth. And Rav Shimon Schwab comments that why is it that Pinchas was not inaugurated? Why was it that someone was left out, a descendant of Aaron was left out? If they were inaugurated because of who they were, what was Pinchas missing? And he answers that it must be that there was some kind of flaw in Aaron himself, that even though he was made a Kohen and his sons were made Kohanim, that there was something lacking in Aaron that he was not able, that not all his descendants were made Kohanim, and the exception was Pinchas. So he said, what was that flaw in Aaron? That flaw was that Aaron was the greatest, he was the epitome of those who loved peace and pursued peace. That the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says that we should make ourselves like a student of Aaron the Kohen, who, like we said, loved peace and pursued peace. That he made peace between enemies. He made peace between within families, between men and their wives. So, but what he was lacking was the opposite. He was so far in that direction of loving peace that there was a flaw in his character that when maybe there were times that when he should have stood up and fought, that he didn't, because he was such a peaceful person that he didn't fight when the time came for fighting. And that was when the Jews made the golden calf. So he went along with it and didn't fight against it. He didn't stand up to them. And this was perhaps because of his great love for peace. He didn't, sometimes you have to fight, and he didn't. So therefore, not all his descendants were made Kohanim. But when Zimri sinned, when he publicly brought a Midianite princess into his tent in defiance of Moshe, so Pinchas stood up and said, "This isn't right. We have to do something." And he went in and killed them at great personal risk. So he fixed that flaw in Aaron by fighting when it was the time to fight and not worrying about the peace, that there's some times that you have to fight, and he fought when to defend the honor of Hashem and the honor of Moshe, and therefore at that point this flaw was fixed, so he was made a Kohen as well. Okay, so now about these garments. So in verse 2 on page 465, chapter 28, verse 2, it says, "You shall make vestments of sanctity for Aaron your brother for glory and splendor." And in verse 3, "And you shall speak to all the wise-hearted people whom I have invested with the spirit of wisdom, and they shall make the vestments of Aaron to sanctify him, to minister to me." So right away, there's an obvious contradiction, and it's repetitive and it's contradictory. First, it says that you shall make vestments of sanctity for Aaron and your brother for glory and splendor, meaning Moshe is the one who makes it. And then it says, "And you shall speak to all the wise-hearted people, and they shall make the vestments of Aaron to sanctify him, to minister to me." So which one is it? If it's just a matter of that by Moshe delegating, that's his part in the creation, it just should have just said, tell them to do it. Why does it start? You make it, and you tell them, and they'll make it. So the Beis Yitzchak answers, and this is really based on something that we spoke about last week at length, and that is that especially with holy things, but with everything, but especially with holy things like the Beis Hamikdash, that there's a physical version of the Beis Hamikdash in this world, that we have a physical structure that's a very holy spiritual place, but it's a physical structure. That's the temple, or in this case, we're talking about the tabernacle, that we have a physical structure that's a tabernacle. But corresponding to that, there's a heavenly tabernacle, that in the spiritual world, there's a spiritual tabernacle that corresponds to the physical tabernacle. And like we said last week, when we were talking about the donations, that when someone gave a donation to the physical structure, so at the same time they're giving a donation to the spiritual structure, they're giving the material to build the spiritual structure. But the spiritual material, what built the spiritual structure, isn't the physical thing that they gave, it's the intention in their hearts. It's the generosity of their hearts, that intention, that builds the spiritual structure. And it's the physical stuff they give that builds the physical structure. That our intentions, our feelings, when we do a mitzvah, that's the spiritual aspect, and that's what builds the spiritual structure. So in this case, also, when it comes to the building of the fabricating of the Kohen's and the Kohen Gadol's garments, so Hashem was telling Moshe that you make the garments, as it says, you shall make the vestments of sanctity for Aaron your brother for glory and splendor. What are these garments for sanctity or for glory and splendor? These are the spiritual garments. These are the garments in the spiritual world. And how's that created? With Moshe's intentions, that when you go to these people and delegate as you're commanded by Hashem, to have them create these garments, by doing that, your intentions with that itself creates the spiritual garments. Whereas the physical garments were made, which are very spiritual things, they're holy things, but they were made by the craftsmen, as it says, "And you shall speak to all the wise-hearted people whom I invested with the spirit of wisdom, they shall make the vestments of Aaron to sanctify him, to minister to me." And that's referring to the physical holy garments. Okay, so then it continues, what are the garments that they make? In verse 4, on the bottom of page 465, "These are the vestments that they shall make: a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a tunic of a box like knit, a turban, and a sash. They shall make garments of sanctity for Aaron your brother and his sons to minister to me. They shall take the gold, the turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, and linen." Okay, so those are the various garments, and we'll see a little more detail about how exactly they were made. And okay, we'll get there later. Okay, so on page 467, it begins, the first garment that's mentioned is the ephod. "So they shall make an ephod of gold, turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, and twisted linen with a woven design." And for those who have the Art Scroll Stone Chumash on page 467, we have a picture of the ephod. And the ephod was kind of like an apron that was like closed in the back and open in front. So you would bring it around from back to front and close it in front with a belt like protrusions that were attached, and it had shoulder straps. And we'll see the shoulder straps they used to hang the breastplate from. And if you notice the materials, it says turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, and twisted linen with a woven design. That should jump out at you right away. that there's a prohibition in the Torah of wearing shatnez, which is clothes with a mixture of wool and linen. And in fact, that this was an exception to that rule, that when it comes to the clothes that the Kohen wore, so they were actually commanded to wear clothing that contained this mixture. And because of the mitzvah, it was permitted. And our sages actually derive from specifically shatnez and mitzvahs, that very often when we have, with exceptions, but when we have a contradiction between a positive commandment, a commandment that thou shalt do the following, and a prohibition, thou shalt not do the following, if there's conflict between two, very often our sages say that the positive commandment pushes away the prohibition. So for example, when it comes, and one of the examples is with tzitzis, that if somebody has, the only tzitzis someone has available, let's say they have the only garment that let's say that they have a garment that's linen, that has 4 corners, and the only tzitzis, and they'd have the strings that they have to put on it are made out of wool. So the Gemara says they can in fact make tzitzis out of that, because the positive commandment of putting on tzitzis will override the prohibition against the forbidden mixtures, and that's the case in the Kohanim's clothes as well. Okay, so that is the ephod, and it continues about the ephod in verse 9. You shall take the 2 shoham stones, this is 2 stones, and engrave upon them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 of their names on 1 stone, the names of 6 remaining ones on the 2nd stone, according to the order of their births. And then you shall make gold settings from them. And in verse 12 on page 469, you shall place both stones on the shoulder straps of the ephod, remembrance stone for the children of Israel. So like I said, these the ephod, which is like kind of like an apron that's closed in the back, and you bring it around from the back to front and close it in the front, and it has shoulder straps. So these shoulder straps have on the shoulders, each shoulder strap has a stone where 6 of the names of 6 of the 12 tribes are inscribed on each one. And then in verse 13, you shall make settings of gold and 2 chains of pure gold, make them in the edges of braided craftsmanship, and place braided chains on the settings. And then in verse 15, the next of the garments that the Kohen Gadol wore, the high Kohen wore, you shall make a breastplate of judgment of a woven design, like the craftsmanship of the ephod shall you make it, of gold, turquoise, purple, scarlet, wool, and linen. Again, you have that, what would usually be a prohibited mixture. And square shall it be folded. Folded its length and a half cubit, and its width a half cubit. So it was a cubit long, and they folded that in half. So there was like a pocket inside. And then you shall fill it with stone mountings, 4 rows of stones, a row of odin, pitchda, barakas, the 1 row. So you have 4 rows with 3 stones in each. The 2nd row, nofach, saper, yahalom. The 3rd row, lashem, shavo, and achlama. And the 4th row, tarsha, sham, yashveh, set in gold, they shall be on their mountings. So it was a cloth breastplate with the mountings attached to the cloth with the stones in the mountings. And the stones shall be according to the names of the sons of Israel, 12 according to their names, engraved like a signet ring, each according to its name shall they be for the 12 tribes. So they would have, each of these 12 stones had one of the names of a name of one of the tribes inscribed on it. And then it continues, for the breastplate you shall make, and the breastplate was attached to the ephod, attached to the shoulder straps, and attached to the sides. And it details it how exactly they're attached. And then on page 471, verse 30, or I'll go back to verse 29. Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel on the breastplate of judgment when he enters the sanctuary, as a constant remembrance before Hashem. And as an aside, it's called the breastplate of judgment. And the Gemara says that the wearing of this breastplate atones for mistakes that judges make in judgment. So when a judge sincerely tries to decide a question and he makes a mistake, so the breastplate atones for that mistake. And then it continues in verse 30, into the breastplate of judgment shall you place the Urim and Tumim, and they shall be in Aaron's heart when he comes before Hashem. And Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel on his heart constantly before Hashem. So what is this Urim and Tumim? So our sages say, the Gemara says that they would use that when the king of Israel would have a question as to how to proceed for the good of the kingdom. So they would ask the Kohen Gadol, they would actually have the Kohen Gadol ask the Urim V'Tumim, that they would ask the question, and the letters on the Choshen would light up or would be revealed in a way that would answer the question that they asked. And this was through the Urim V'Tumim, which the Ramban understands to be that inside. We mentioned that the cloth of the Choshen of the breastplate was folded in half, and there was a pocket inside. So they had a scroll with the names of Hashem. The Urim and the Tumim were names of Hashem that were written on that scroll, and through that, he says that the Urim would cause the letters on the stones of the breastplate to light up, and the Tumim would help the Kohen understand what the meaning of the message that they were being sent was. And the Vilna Gaon brings out, really, he says to bring out what it means, that like it needed an interpretation for him to understand that. He says that there was an incident in the book of Shmuel where Chana, who was a woman who was barren, she was childless, her co-wife had many children, and she was childless, and she came into the temple, into the Mishkan in Shiloh, and she was praying there. And Eli, the Kohen Gadol, saw her and thought that she was drunk. And he said to her, like, how long are you going to be drunk? And she said, I'm not drunk, I'm a woman of broken spirit. And he blessed her with a child, and that child was Shmuel, one of the greatest of all the prophets. So, okay, so the Vilna Gaon says, what was it that made him think that she was drunk? So the Vilna Gaon said that when he saw her, he saw on the breastplate that on the stones of the breastplate, he saw the letters Shin, Chaf, Resh, Hey, all lit up, which would spell Shakura, which means a drunken woman. But that wasn't the message that he was being sent. In fact, that those letters could also be read as Keshera, which means someone who's kosher, meaning she's kosher, she's good, she's she's a righteous woman. So whereas they lit up to understand the message, meaning it may be out of order, and to understand the message, you needed divine inspiration. You needed to be inspired, and that's what the second that's what the Tumim, the Urim lights up the letters, and the Tumim is what allows the Kohen to understand it. Okay, so moving on is the robe of the ephod. So in verse 31, so on page 471, you shall make the robe of the ephod entirely of turquoise wool. Its head opening shall be folded over within. Its opening shall have a border all around of weaver's work. It shall be for like the opening of a coat of mail. It may not be torn. So meaning that it had a thick collar where they put the head through, so it wouldn't tear. And it shall make on its hem pomegranates of turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool on its hem all around, and gold bells between them all around, etc. And it must be, in verse 35 on page 473, it must be an Aaron in order for him to minister. Its sound shall be heard when he enters the sanctuary before Hashem. When he leaves, so that he shall not die. And so they don't have a picture here of this robe. But I say it was kind of like a poncho, that it was like a, like you had the front, or like tzitzis, that you had the front and the back, but not attached at the sides. But it was very long, and it was made completely of techelas, of this like light blue wool. And it had bells on the bottom. Our sages, the Gemara says that it was to atone for the sin of lashon hara. So that the bells made noise to atone for those who are making too much noise. Additionally, it says so they make noise when he goes into enters the sanctuary, so he may not die. What's the meaning of that? That's to teach us a lesson, and that is that when he's approaching the sanctuary, God knows where he is. God knows he's coming. That he doesn't have to be knocking or making noise when he's coming in, but it's to teach us a lesson in derech eretz, a lesson in appropriate behavior, and that is that not to go into somewhere unannounced. Don't like sneak around and go somewhere unannounced. And our sages say that we shouldn't even go into our own houses without knocking on the door, just to let some people know that we're coming, even if it's our own house. And one may think that, like, if they're doing anything they wouldn't want me to see, they shouldn't be doing it. But this is what our sages say, that people are entitled to privacy, and we shouldn't just be, surprise people, just like surprise people with our presence. And it's proper etiquette to announce ourselves before entering a room or before entering our house. Then comes the head plate on verse 36. You shall make a head plate of pure gold. This is on page 473, verse 36. And you shall engrave upon it, engrave like a signet ring, holy to Hashem. You shall place it on a cord of turquoise wool, and it shall be on the turban opposite in front of the turban shall it be. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, so that Aaron will give forgiveness, bring forgiveness for the sin regarding the sacred offerings the children of Israel consecrate. For any gifts of their sacred offerings, it shall be on his forehead, always to bring them favor before Hashem. And on page 473, they have in the stone chumash, they have a picture of the tzitz of the head plate. And if you look at the picture there, if you have it, it has, or I'll just run through the other garments that they had. So far, these were garments that only the Kohen Gadol would wear. Next are the garments that a normal Kohen would also have. One of them is the tunic. You shall make a linen tunic of box like knit. You shall make a linen turban, and you shall make a sash of embroiderer's work. And this the Kohen Gadol would wear. And it continues, verse 40, for the sons of Aaron you shall make them tunics, you shall make them sashes, you shall make them headdresses for glory and splendor. With them you shall dress Aaron your brother and his sons with him, you shall anoint them, inaugurate them, and sanctify them, and they shall minister to me. And in 42, you shall make them linen breeches to cover the flesh of their nakedness. This was like linen pants. From the hip to the thigh shall they be. They shall be on Aaron and his sons, even though they wore this tunic, which was it was like a shirt, but it was a very long shirt. It went down to their ankles. It went all the way down, but still they needed to wear pants for to cover the flesh for modesty. And they shall be on Aaron and his sons when they enter the tent of meeting, when they approach the altar to serve in holiness. They shall not bear sin and die. It is an eternal decree for him and for his offspring after him that they have to be wearing these vestments when they do the service in the Mishkan and the tabernacle and the temple. So you see that the Kohen wore a tzitz. He wore the golden head plate, and he wore a hat. The Gemara says that in between that, there was a gap between the forehead plate and the hat, and that's where his tefillin went. That the Kohen was Gadol, or the Kohen Gadol was still able to wear his head tefillin because of that, but he was not able to wear his arm tefillin because the where am I? I'm not sure where it is exactly, but when they wore the tunic, the halacha was the rule was that there could be nothing, no interposition. There could be nothing in between, interrupting between these vestments and their skin. They couldn't have any bandages or anything of that nature in between their skin and the vestments. And tefillin would be considered an interruption. It would be an interposition. So therefore, they were not able to wear armed tefillin because that would come in between this tunic and their body. But he was able to wear a head tefillin because there was a gap where he could put it. Okay.
But the sons had an interposition.
What did they have?
They were wearing the little pants so you couldn't see up their tunic.
Right, that was one of the garments that's mentioned, though.
Yeah.
So you're right, but that's one of the holy garments that's mentioned in verse 42. You shall make them linen breeches to cover the flesh of the nakedness. That meaning there couldn't be anything interrupting other than these vestments that are mentioned. You're right, I should have been clearer about that. But this would bring up a problem, and that is that if you've ever been in Yerushalayim in the winter, in Jerusalem in the winter, it can get cold there. I think when I was in Yerushalayim, I grew up in St. Louis, where it could get nice and cold. It gets below 0 in the winter. But I don't think I've ever been as cold as when I was in Yerushalayim, because it gets to you. It's so wet. It rains a lot of the winter. It's wet. It like chills you to the bones. And they weren't allowed to wear, and they were working in the courtyard of the tabernacle, or the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash of the temple. And this was all they were allowed to wear. They would have these pants, they would have a hat, they would have a tunic, and they would have a belt, the regular Kohanim. So you could, as you can imagine, and they didn't have any shoes, and they were standing on a stone floor, so they would be freezing. They would get really cold, and in fact, the Rabbeinu Bachya speaks out that they had a doctor, they had someone who was appointed to look after the Kohanim and treat them when they got sick, because they would get sick they would get sick from the cold. And they had like a room where they could warm up. I think it's a Mishnah in Yuma actually says that there was a room that had a fire in it at the side of the courtyard of the temple, where the Kohanim could go to warm up. Because like I said, they weren't allowed to wear any other clothes, and they weren't allowed to wear shoes, and they were barefoot on a freezing cold floor in the winter. Okay, so now it continues in chapter 29.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
You said that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. So the negative commandment you spoke of was not having anything between the skin and the garment, but the positive commandment isn't a positive commandment to wear tefillin?
No, that's a very good question. That's not the example I was giving, and I don't have a good answer to that. I'd have to look at the Gemara, but like I said, there are a lot of exceptions to this rule. That the general rule is not to have a positive commandment would override a prohibition. But like I said, there are a lot of exceptions. It could be, I don't know. I'd have to look in the Gemara, but it is a good question. When the Gemara is discussing it, one of the things it said that usually Shabbos was such a serious mitzvah that a positive command would not override Shabbos. Once again, with exceptions, that bris milah, that we do a circumcision on Shabbos, even though there's a prohibition against drawing blood on Shabbos, but we could do that, and the Gemara derives that from Psukim. But and also where there's two prohibitions, like there's a prohibition plus there's a positive commandment that turns into a prohibition. So we wouldn't do a positive commandment wouldn't allow us to override a prohibition. There are a lot of exceptions. I'm not sure specifically what's the reason here. But yeah, so it is a good question. Okay, so now on page 475, chapter 29, we have the inauguration ritual. It's the inauguration of the Kohanim, to make them Kohanim. So this is the matter that you shall do for them, to sanctify them, to minister for me. Take 1 young bull, 2 rams unblemished with unleavened bread, unleavened loaves mixed with oil, unleavened wafers made with oil of fine wheat flour, you shall make them. So the offerings that they're bringing here are 1 young bull and 2 rams. And the Medrash says that this was a little bit of a sign for Aaron that 2 of his sons would not survive. That the bull represented Aaron, and the 2 rams represented 2 of his sons, because 2 of his sons were destined to die, as we'll see at the 8th day of this inauguration. 2 of his sons, Nadav and Avihu, died when they brought an inappropriate incense offering for Hashem. And it continues with how they would go about inaugurating them, that you place them in a single basket, bring them near in the basket with the bull and the 2 rams. Aaron and his sons you shall bring near the entrance of the tent of meeting. You shall immerse them in the water, that they after you dip them in the mikveh. You shall take the vestments, dress Aaron with his tunic, etc. But this is interesting here, that it says, you shall take the vestments, dress Aaron with the tunic, the robe, the ephod, the ephod and the breastplate, and you shall gird. I think that's a mistake. 1 second. 5. I'm sorry. Yes. You shall, in verse 5, you shall take the vestments and dress Aaron with the tunic, the robe of the ephod and the breastplate, and you shall gird him with the belt of the ephod. You shall place a turban on his head and place the crown of sanctity over the turban. That's the tzitz, the forehead plate, and you shall take the anointment oil and pour it on his head and anoint it. You notice there's something missing there. And this is what I think Sid brought up, was the pants are missing. And the Rabbeinu Bachya says that in fact Moshe did not dress them in the pants that they put on themselves, because it wouldn't be respectful for Moshe for them to stand completely unclothed in front of them, and for him to put their pants on them. So that they would do themselves, Moshe put all the other garments on them. And then they did the same to his sons with the regular Cohen garments. And it continues, the priesthood shall be an eternal duty for them, and you shall inaugurate Aaron and his sons. This, that the priesthood shall be eternal duty for them, means that their sons inherit it after them. And on page 477, it discusses how they would bring the bull, and then how you'd bring the ram. And in verse 15, on page 477, it states, you shall take the first ram, Aaron and his sons shall lean their hands on the head of the ram. When they lean their heads, that usually implies that they're confessing their sins. And you shall slaughter the ram, take its blood, throw it on the altar all around, and they would burn it on the altar, cut it up and burn it on the altar. And they would do a similar thing, but with the second ram in verse 19, Aaron and his sons shall lean their hands on the head of the ram. You shall slaughter the ram, you shall take some of the blood and place it on the middle part of Aaron, of the ear of Aaron, on the middle part of the ear of his sons, the right one, and on the thumb of the right hand, the big toe of their right foot. You shall throw the blood upon the altar all around. So they did a procedure with the blood of the second ram. And you shall take some of the blood on the altar and some of the anointment oil and sprinkle on Aaron and his vestments and on his sons and the vestments, and the vestments of his sons with him, and he and his vestments and his sons vestments with him shall become holy. This was how they consecrated, sanctified the Kohanim and their vestments. And then it continues with what they would do in the once again, the process for the offerings that they would bring to sanctify Aaron and his sons. And in verse 29, the holy vestments, on page 479, the holy vestments of Aaron shall belong to his sons after him, to become elevated through them, to become inaugurated. For a 7-day period, the Kohen who succeeds him from his sons, who shall enter the tent of meeting to serve in the sanctuary, shall don them. Once again, go through this process. And in verse 31, you shall take the inauguration ram and cook its flesh in a holy place. Aaron and his sons shall eat the flesh of the ram and the bread that is in the basket before the entrance of the tent of meeting. They who receive atonement through them shall eat them, to inaugurate them, to sanctify them. An alien shall not eat, for they are holy. This verse, they who receive atonement through them shall eat them, literally is they eat them, that they are atoned. And our sages derive from here that just like the slaughtering of the animal and the receiving the blood and sprinkling it on the altar are all part of the process of getting atonement for the person who the offering is brought for, the eating of the Kohanim is also part of that process, that the Kohanim bring about atonement for someone through the eating of the offering that they bring. Okay, and in verse 35, thus shall you do for Aaron for his sons, like everything that I've commanded you. For a 7-day period you shall inaugurate them. 1 bull shall be made for each day of the atonement, etc. And then on verse 38 on page 481, we have a new mitzvah, and that is the mitzvah of the korban tamid, the daily offerings. And this is on page 481, verse 38. This is what you shall offer upon the altar: 2 sheep within their first year. Every day continually, you shall offer 1 sheep in the morning, a second sheep shall you offer in the afternoon, and flour and wine with each sheep. And this was done continually in the tabernacle and in the temple until pretty much until it was destroyed. Where when the temple was besieged, one of the things we fast, I believe it's on the 17th of Tammuz, one of the reasons that we fast is because during the siege of Yerushalayim, we weren't able anymore to bring the tamid offering at that time. That we were besieged, and we ran out of sheep, and we didn't have any more sheep to bring as an offering, and that's one of the reasons why we fast. Okay, and it continues on verse 43 on page 41. I shall set my meeting there with the children of Israel. I shall be sanctified with my glory. I shall sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar, and Aaron and his son shall I sanctify to minister to me. I shall rest my presence among the children of Israel, and I shall be their God. They shall know that I am Hashem their God, who took them out of the land of Egypt to rest my presence among them. I am Hashem their God. And that's Hashem's promise that he'll rest his presence, his Shekhinah amongst us. And the Parsha ends on page 483 with the Altar of Incense. And it begins in verse 43, chapter 30, verse 1. You shall make an altar upon which to bring incense up, and smoke of acacia wood shall you make it. Its length a cubit, its width a cubit, it shall be square. You cover it with pure gold. And there are rings, and you put poles through the rings and cover them with gold. And it goes in verse 6, you shall place it before the partition that is by the ark of the testimonial tablets, in front of the cover that is on the testimonial tablets, where I shall set my meeting with you, meaning it goes in the room where the menorah and the table of showbread is. And in verse 7, upon it Aaron shall bring up the spice incense up in smoke every morning when he cleans the lamps. She'll bring it up in smoke. And in the afternoon when he kindles the lamps, he shall bring it up in smoke again, bring more incense. And in verse 9, you shall not bring upon an alien incense or an elevation offering or a meal offering, nor you may pour a libation on it. That's only for the outside altar that's in the courtyard. And Aaron shall bring atonement upon his horns once a year from the blood of the sin offerings of atonement on Yom Kippur. Once a year shall you bring atonements upon it for your generations. It's the Holy of Holies to Hashem. So this was the altar, the golden altar that went in the sanctuary. The commentaries ask, why is it that this is here? In last week's Parsha, in Parshas Truma, we had all the vessels of the Mishkan, all the vessels of the tabernacle. We had the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, the table of showbread. We had the altar, the copper altar that went in the courtyard. Why is the golden altar taught separately in the end of Tetzaveh? So the Ramban answers that it served a completely different function. The Ramban and the Savannah both say a similar idea. They both say that the incense altar served a different function, that the other vessels were in order to make the tabernacle into the tabernacle. And they all represented something that as a whole was the place where Hashem would rest his divine presence amongst us. But the Ramban says that the altar of incense was there because once we have the Shekhinah amongst us, once we build this temple or this tabernacle for Hashem and he rests his Shekhinah amongst us, he rests his presence amongst us, we have to be very careful. When you're in the palace of the king, you have to act with the proper etiquette and you have to act very delicately. And what a person does in their living room is, how they act in their living room is not the way you could act in the palace in front of the king. And when Hashem's presence is amongst us, we have to act very carefully and with the proper dignity and respect. And because of that, there's a danger of having the Mishkan, having the tabernacle, having Hashem's presence, that people might not act with the proper respect and bring punishment on us. And the Ramban says that the incense has this, has the properties that it could remove Hashem's anger, especially when it comes to a plague. When we're punished with a plague, it could remove Hashem's anger. And we find this with Korach, that after the sin of Korach and his followers, so there was a plague, and Moshe sent Aaron with incense to stand in the middle of the Jewish people, and it said that he stood between the angel of death and the rest, between the dead and between the living, and that stopped the plague. That the incense has this inherent property that it stops the plague, and that's why we need this golden altar in order to atone and protect us from the sin of acting without the proper respect and proper dignity from being around Hashem's presence. And the Sforno says, it comes with a similar approach, but he says that it's like we said, that the other vessels were in order to make the Mishkan, make the tabernacle into the tabernacle where Hashem's presence would rest. And once we have Hashem's presence there, we honor it with the Ketores, with this offering of incense. So it's not to bring Hashem's presence there, but it's to honor Hashem's presence when it's there. And that's why this is put separately, because it's put after we have the construction and inauguration of the temple. Now we talk about what do we do now that we have the temple? We honor Hashem with this offering of incense. And the Haftarah is actually a very unusual Haftarah because we don't read it that often. Because like I mentioned last week, Tetzaveh especially is almost always Parsha Zachar. It's almost always the Shabbos before Purim. But because this year is a leap year, there's an extra Adar, so Tetzaveh, we read its own Haftarah. And that Haftarah is about just like this Parsha, Parshas Tetzaveh, was about the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and the clothes of the Kohanim. So the Haftarah is from Yecheskel, from the prophet Ezekiel, that he was prophesying about. First, he prophesied about Hashem's glory leaving the temple, leaving the first temple, leaving the temple, but then he prophesied about the third temple that would be built with the coming of Mashiach and how what would go on in the third temple. Okay, Shkayach, have a great Shabbos.